want Republicans dead.
Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay?
The women with the least likelihood of getting pregnant are the ones most worried about having abortions.
On January 6th of 2021, you had tens of thousands of people peacefully protesting.
So, it's not a right-wing conspiracy theory. It's not QAnon. It's real.
Hey folks, it's Rick, and welcome back to the Enemies List. I am delighted today to welcome my friend Norm Eisen to the show. Norm is a CNN commentator, an amazing and thoughtful person who understands the legal and ethical nature of what used to be commonplace among high government officials, which is they played by the laws and the rules and followed ethical guidelines. And he's also been able to point out where we've departed from that in the era of Donald Trump. Norm is also the author of an absolutely terrific new book called Trying Trump, a guide to his first election interference criminal trial. I read it in about 2 sittings. I loved it because it really does outline the step-by-step, the tick-tock, if you will, of how these impeachment interference or these election interference trials will go. Norm has also been in New York in the courtroom a couple times as Donald Trump has faced his porn star hush money election interference trial. And so, Norm, thank you so much for coming on the show today. It's great to have you here. I want to start out by asking you, how's Donald doing? You're seeing him in court every day. How's he doing so far?
It's such a good question, Rick. And thank you for having me on the show and for all that you do.
Thank you.
You are a national treasure, and I love it that whatever policy differences you and I and so many others, from George Conway to Michael Ludig, whatever policy differences we thought we had, we are united in our veneration for American democracy. And, you know, people
Absolutely.
ask about what are there silver linings of this moment of stress where I'm seeing court now, seeing Trump in court every day as the system attempts to hold him accountable for what was the gateway drug. As you said, it's the title of the book, the 2016 election interference. I argue in the book that it's the gateway drug for all that follows. It's a reminder that in this moment we have more as Americans that we share than that separates us. And one of the things that you and I have in common is extremely close scrutiny of the former president. And I will tell you, seeing him every day, he's under great stress, and he should be. I wrote for my CNN trial diary. I do 1 or 2 diary entries every day. That after the hearing on the gag order, and now the hearing has culminated in fines and a warning of jail time. After the hearing on the gag order, Trump was hunched over. He slumped down in his chair like a naughty boy. I almost felt sorry for him. He gazed, head down. He was gazing into his lap, couldn't meet the judge's eye. Then when he left court that day, hunched over. So I think the trial is taking its toll. The true answer to your question is that his mood and affect varies from day to day and minute to minute. He does sleep a lot. So, he needs a moniker, Rick. You're just the man to make that go rival. Maybe Drowsy Donald.
I have to admit, I did not come up with it, but I thought Don Snorleone was
pretty good. That was pretty good. He's fallen asleep most days of trial. The important thing is that the jury's not sleeping. They are on the edge of their seat. And, I actually go to court with a little set of binoculars so I can watch what's going on as if I'm sitting right now. It depends on the angle you're in, as if I'm sitting in the
Right.
right there next to the people. And that jury, they are on the edge of their seat, and they remain that way even for the more dull witnesses. I would say more ordinary.
Right.
They're not dull, like the document custodians. To them, it's like a
Mhm.
murder mystery. So it's been fascinating watching Trump and the others.
That's very interesting because I have not seen a lot of coverage of the describing how the jury seems to be reacting to the testimony they're seeing so far. Obviously, I think it struck me that and I thought about this the other day, like when the jury watches a guy like David Pecker just sort of walk through everything without any reservation or hesitation. I have to imagine that affects them, where this is in a lot of ways new information for them. Everybody thinks they know everything about Trump,
Yes.
but they really don't. And so um, I want to ask you two questions about that. How impactful do you think the David Pecker testimony was, and did David Pecker's testimony set up a sort of line of fact defense for the attacks they're going to make on Michael Cohen when he testifies about Cohen's credibility?
The Pecker testimony was very impactful because it established Trump's state of mind. It established an agreement by Trump, Cohen, and Pecker to influence the election through these illicit expenditures far in excess of campaign contribution rules.
Sure.
And it did corroborate Cohen. The whole case you can think of as being an interlocking set of jigsaw puzzles, and for every Cohen piece of the puzzle, on each side there's an interlocking piece corroborating. So it fits in. That's why they're taking their time, and of course that's why they're not starting with Cohen. They'll come to Cohen as they're deeper in the case, when they've built the frame of the puzzle and they're ready to fit those Cohen pieces precisely in place.
So your assessment so far of the prosecution team in this case is, and I think there was a little sort of assumption that, that on the Trump side of the equation, that, oh, these are just normal New York State prosecutors. They're not gonna bring Todd Blanche into the room. They're not gonna have the same level of highly paid legal defense. But it strikes me so far that Blanche has not covered himself in glory here, and that this has not gone as smoothly for Trump as they might have hoped.
There was a press report this week that Trump wants his team to be more aggressive. And there's a reflection, if that's true, I'm sure it is true, that it has not been going as well as they had hoped. In Trying Trump, my new book, I provide the biographies of everybody involved, including the witnesses we've seen, the prosecutors, the defense, the judge. It's a very distinguished group of prosecutors. It's led by Matthew Colangelo, who has had a long career in and outside of government as a civil rights and democracy litigator, came to the DA's office after helping run the New York Attorney General Tish James' civil fraud investigation. He did that before the trial that resulted in the massive judgment for fraud in his operation of his businesses. And Colangelo, when he opened to the jury, described this case as an election fraud case. And there's, whether you call it illicit election influence, election interference, election fraud, the point is, this is the 2016 version of what Trump tried to do in 2020, deceive voters to grasp power and cover it up. So they've got an all-star team. We've seen a lot of Josh Steinglass, very experienced prosecutor who rose through the ranks in that office, very competitive office, to become one of their top guns. And you see why. He's done brilliantly. And then you have Susan Hoffinger, who's the third member of the triumvirate. Very, very capable trio who are heading things up. Chris Conroy, a fourth, has been doing most of the legal issues, including the briefing and argument on the gag order. So where we got sanctions against Trump, and I think he's on a very short. He's made 14 allegedly contemptuous statements. I think if he makes the 15th, he's going to jail, and he knows it. He's tiptoeing. He knows it.
So that's a question I keep, I've wondered about extensively. We all know, I think, that the minute Trump, gets $1,000 fine, which is the maximum apparently the court could impose for violating the order. The minute those things happen, he doesn't really care about that. That to him is like a badge of honor. But the minute he has to go, and I keep telling people, like, he's never going to Rikers. They're never going to put him in Rikers, even overnight. But he might go to MCC. He might go to some other holding facility. The minute he has to spend one night in jail, I think Donald Trump, his world starts to collapse. No phone, no staff, no makeup, no hairspray, no nothing. I'm just curious about, do you think there's any chance? I mean, this guy is obviously he's obviously, as you said, under very great stress. I'm wondering if he's smart enough or disciplined enough to be able to not get himself landed in jail.
Well, we'll find out. He has two risks in that regard. One is if there's a 15th allegedly contemptuous incident, the judge found 9 out of the 10 that the prosecution brought to his attention to be a violation of his gag order. He will this week hear another 4. So, and then, he won't send him to jail for those 4 because they were before his ruling. But Trump is on the knife's edge. Now, if he stepped back, the first step back might be for a few hours. It might be overnight. His Secret Service will be with him. He'll be allowed to recompose himself in the morning before court to put on his suit and tie. So, he's not going to show up disheveled in an orange jumpsuit the next morning.
Right.
But the other very serious issue here, and this is chapter 8 of my book, but also New York Times ran a guest essay from me. I'm so honored to write for them. Roughly once a month, they'll take something from me. I love it. It's one of the highlights of my months. That people are not properly apprehending the risk that if Donald Trump is convicted and does not win the presidency, that he is going to spend time behind bars in this case.
I think a lot of Americans have come to believe he is immune from justice, and that the courts are helpless against him. And I really have to say, I've always thought that the court cases alone weren't going to change the election, but that there was a possibility the court cases would start to change the perception that anybody's above the law, because that certainly was in people's minds, including both his supporters and his opponents for a long time, that Trump was above the law. And I think we're slowly evolving away from that position.
Interesting. Rick,
I feel like it's changing.
Let me just make the case that a conviction, right now this is the only case where we know there might be a conviction. I just make the case to you that a conviction could have a profound electoral impact. I wrote another piece, another one of my columns, guest essays for the Times, with pollster Celinda Lake and the messaging
I know Slaughter, sure.
guru Anat Shanker, and we looked at all of the polls of 2023. And what we found was that if Donald Trump is convicted and sentenced, he got to be sentenced. That seems to be, it surprised us. We thought it would just be conviction. If he's convicted and sentenced for a serious offense, and a majority of Americans think all 4 of the criminal cases against him are serious, that that has a profound effect in the polls. For example, if you look at the crosstabs of the big New York Times Siena poll that they did at the end of 2023, there is actually, on conviction and sentencing, there is a 14-point swing in the 6 swing states. So it's a double swing.
That's not nothing.
No, you go from an average of Trump plus 4 to an average of Biden, Trump plus 5 to an average of Biden plus 9, 14-point swing in those 6 states. So now it's early. These are horse race polls.
Sure.
Nobody, you're asking voters,
100%.
but what are they going to do in a hypothetical? But the flip side is that people don't appreciate there is a very serious effect from the New York case. And when you explain that it's not a hush money case, and it's not, and that's why I wrote the book, to explain to people, hush money is not a crime.
Yes.
It's an election interference, election influence, election fraud case, like 2020. When you explain that, and of course, it's like what Trump said this week in Time magazine he's going to do again, threatening violence in 2024. When you explain that to people, you get that swing. So now we'll see if it actually happens, or if it's just removing the mantle of invincibility, as you point out.
So I'm going to ratchet out to a much broader question for you, and I know. You've talked about this extensively for years now. Donald Trump, I think, ushered in what I would say is arguably the most corrupt era of our presidential politics since Andrew Jackson. How do we return back to that, the expectation that you don't act like a Donald Trump as president? I mean, look, I don't think Biden is, of course, but I think there's been this sort of like desperation now, like, oh, whatever the president's doing, it's a desperate situation, so he can do whatever he wants. How do we get away from that sense of that the ethical guidelines, that the guardrails and the institutional impulses to keep people on the straight and narrow, they really fell apart? I'm just curious what your thoughts are on getting that sense back into the minds of people, so that it's not this sense of chaos and amorality defining.
If I can do a slight digression, I'm the master of digressions. Your analysis relative to Jackson is so interesting, because I don't think we can measure. I don't think it's apples to apples in the modern era. You could make an argument for Grant. You could make an argument for Harding and the Teapot Dome. My friend John Dean wrote a whole book saying that we've been unfair to Harding. If you okay. That's a very short shelf of books in the library, the Celebrations of Harding.
Right.
Certainly, if you want to come to the modern era, a lot of institutional corruption was accepted within the confines of the presidency, of how you campaigned. Johnson, there's no Republican monopoly on this. Johnson
certainly not.
Had some very dubious campaign finance and business practices. although he's history has come to appreciate his accomplishments. You had the institutionalized corruption of the Jim Crow era. You could argue from a equity lens that Wilson's dismantling of black employment in government was so.
Right.
There's a lot of corruption. I think we mark the modern era from Watergate, and Trump was worse than
Sure.
Nixon, no question.
Takes a lot.
He was
but yes.
worse than Nixon. I'm not an anti. That's why I get along with with you and my trial buddy George Conway. We sit together, and Judge Ludig and my other conservatives friends. I'm not I volunteered. I worked on the Trump transition. I felt it was my patriotic duty when he was elected. Politico wrote an article when I was thrown out. Politico wrote an article about it. I've done every transition. Finally, I'm going to answer your question. And I was hoping to help him be non-corrupt. Unfortunately,
right.
It became the most corrupt presidency in modern presidential history. And in order to fix it, and culminating in the electoral crimes of 2020, which made, and the obstruction of the investigation of the conduct of 2016, we now know that there were serious alleged election crimes that year as well. That's what's being tried in New York.
Sure.
So, what we have for people who minimize New York, it's part of a larger pattern of alleged criminality. So, and then there's all the emoluments, the millions of dollars that came from foreign governments. It's the only ethics rule that the founders and framers cared so much about. They put it in the Constitution. To fix it, it's very simple. Voters have to send a clear message that they're not going to tolerate that. I can't believe, I see these polls that despite this ethics and corruption and alleged criminal baggage, that Trump is basically tied with Biden. I can't understand it, Rick.
It's a sign of where the country has evolved to more than anything specific to Joe Biden and Trump, particularly. We are now in a nation that is so tightly divided that it doesn't matter anymore at a certain level. Look, Joe Biden could walk out tomorrow and say, I stayed up late in the lab, I cured cancer and solved world hunger, and Republicans would be, absolutely adamant that he was, a horrible human being. And so but I think there's a lot of increasing, if you drill down into the numbers in the states, love or hate the electoral college, folks, it is the system we have, and it's going to be the one that saves us.
You think? I trust you. This is
I do think.
I just know how to write an emoluments lawsuit or an impeachment article or a book about crime. I did those. I've been in and out of courtrooms since I started as a paralegal before law school in 1985. But the politics, it's dangerous when you let the lawyers do politics. So I trust you on that. And a lot of smart people, Mike Podhorzer, Simon Rosenberg. There's a lot of smart people who say the American voting public is not that depraved. On the other hand, I thought the single most in that shocking Time magazine article, the single most shocking line, they said, are you going to be a dictator on day one? He says, a lot of people like it. And they seem to, even if he doesn't win. That's an issue. We got a third of the country that does seem to like it.
There was an era in this country where no American would say, I want a dictator. No matter what their party, no matter how intense their partisan feelings were, no American would have said, hey, I can't wait to have a dictator in office. And now, because Trump has changed the way. I mean, the Republican Party of today isn't philosophically oriented towards any of the old conservative things that it was oriented towards before, limited government or any of that. They're promising something, I think, that depends on both a character like Trump and, more importantly, depends on the rule of law failing. You can't end up in a country like America with a constitution and a dictator unless the rule of law completely collapses.
The rule of law,
And
yeah.
that's my
I have lived my life within the structures that we call the rule of law in America. Since, again, I knew I wanted to go to law school. As an undergraduate, I really started studying the law in earnest in these poli-sci major, and my area was the law.
Sure.
I went to Brown, where there's there was a famous course of study where you get a poli-sci degree, but you're really prepared for law school. But studying it intellectually. Then I worked in legal jobs over the summers. Then I had a job for a civil rights group basically as a paralegal, where I was going to court and working on stuff, then law school and the rest. And it is it's a mansion, but it's got a lot of, holes in the roof, and the rain is blowing through the missing window panes, and oh my God, termites have eaten at one of the, it's not a, it's not a completely airtight structure. And for those reasons, and that's why we've had the terrible predations over the years. And for our common friend, he was such a good friend to me, and such a great mentor and champion of my nomination in the Senate, and then a mentor when I was an ambassador. John McCain would rail about the corruption, right? The imperfections in the system, so if we're going to count on, so there is another. I know we veered off script and we're just talking, as we sometimes do, but okay. there is another. The rule of law doesn't have to fail. Trump can skillfully exploit those flaws and weaknesses and gaps and kind of weaken the foundation day by day, year by year, until eventually the whole thing collapses. He can't take a bulldozer to it on day one, because the rule of law will push back. But he can chip away day by day by day. I would argue he's already done it, because, for example, he's appointed a bunch of good judges and a handful of judges who operate completely above the law, like Judge Matthew Kaczynski in the Texas federal court. Completely unmoored from the law. He's the go-to because
he's the go-to
it's outcome
guy.
Determinative. And, unfortunately, Alito and Thomas, why is Thomas sitting on cases relating to January 6th, like the immunity case, when his wife is a material witness in the case, who was questioned by the January 6th committee, and who's all over the communications with Mark Meadows, who's now been charged in Georgia and Arizona? Why?
Multiply,
I mean, the corruption. So, that's the threat. But I believe that the American people are not going to tolerate another round of that. And I don't think they want a dictator. And I don't think they want somebody who claims the absolute immunity to use SEAL Team 6 to commit political assassinations.
Yeah, that one keeps me awake at night a little bit. That the immunity question is so pendant right now, in the federal cases in particular, that I'm deeply concerned that we're going to end up with a level of the court's connivance to delay the trial is one thing, to delay Trump being held to account is one thing, but if they establish a new precedent for presidential immunity that goes, as far or even halfway as far as the Trump attorneys seem to be arguing, I think we're in a very different
They
country on this
won't.
day.
What they are doing though is they'll come up with a reasonable rule, and one that actually excludes Trump's behavior here. There'll be enough of the case left that Jack Smith can charge it, in theory. But in practice, they're taking so long, which there's no cause for that. If you look at the timetable in other cases, U.S. v. Nixon,
Sure.
The 14th Amendment case they just decided, but unless they resolve this case by May, which Thomas and Alito won't allow, it's going to drag out to the end of June. There's not going to be time to try the case, number one. And number two, they're going to come up with a rule that prohibits political assassinations, but also protects Joe Biden from being prosecuted by Donald Trump. They're going to come up with that rule, and they're going to send it back down to the court to make fact-finding determinations. Does the Trump case fall within that rule? And if Trump is elected, the case will never be tried because of the delay. So there's a catch-22.
Of course, he'll kill
it.
Right.
The bottom line, I know we're getting to the end of the half hour, and I've blathered so much, I've taken you past the finish line.
No. It's been great. It's been fantastic. No. It's fine.
The other thing that I don't think the American people want, and the saving grace is, I don't think they want an election interference convicted criminal and one who's been sentenced to jail as their next president. And I think that there is part of the reason I was so excited to come on with you. If you and I can explain to the American people, hey, the 2016 case that Trump is being prosecuted for is, as prosecutors claim, an election interference case, election influence, election fraud. Trump was doing the same thing, small scale, he was grooming democracy for what he did to it in 2020, deceiving voters to grasp power and cover it up. I think by the time we get to the end of this, the American people will understand it. I think Trump will be convicted, and if so, likely sentenced to jail. And I think that will help send the message, this is not an American president. What Donald Trump wants to do when he recovers the presidency is move us towards more of a Turkish dictator, Erdogan, Hungarian dictator, Orban, a Vladimir Putin, or worse. That's where Trump wants to go. He's not hiding it. And I think the conviction and sentencing will put the exclamation point on that for America.
I think so too. Well,
thanks,
Norm Eisen, thank you again so much for coming on the show today. Folks, catch Norm on CNN and catch his trial diaries on CNN, running down what he's observing during the course of Donald Trump's election interference trial in New York. And again, the book is Trying Trump, a guide to his first election interference criminal trial. It is terrific, and it will really enlighten you as to how this is going to go. And it gets you out of the bubble of, Donald Trump's sort of alternate reality version of the world. Thanks again, Norm. We look forward to having you back on the show soon.
Appreciate you.